Welcome. It's fantastic to have you here. I hope you've enjoyed the tour, and I hope you'll enjoy the next hour or so. I've been asked to start the ball rolling by a few thoughts about religion in society, what we have to contribute, what some of the areas of conflict might be, and then it's over to you, really. You can ask me more or less whatever you like. And if there's a question I can't answer, I'll look very wise and say that's a very difficult question and run. Well, you've just been reminded about the kind of society this is. In some societies, like France, there's a very, very strong belief that religion shouldn't really be kind of visible in public very much. If you want to go to church or to a synagogue or a mosque or whatever, that's your affair. But there won't be any kind of public official recognition of this. We live in a country where there is a kind of official recognition. Religious people, myself, are visible because, as you've been reminded, we're in the House of Lords, bishops are in the House of Lords, and also we've got the monarchy, which is in many ways bound up with the religious heritage and tradition of this particular state. At the moment, there's quite a lot of what I think of as nibbling away at that idea. Some people aren't very content with it. Some people think that we ought to be more like France. That religion ought to be less visible. There ought not to be bishops in the House of Lords, for instance. We ought not to have a church that's established by law, like Church of England. And in general, you ought not to let arguments based on religion come into arguments about politics, about ethics, and so on. What I want to do in the next few minutes is just to suggest why I'm not too happy with that. And that's not only because I'd be out of a job, if it were true, and I'd be out of the House of Lords anyway. It's because I genuinely have some strong beliefs about the kind of society that is really a healthy society. So let me start by putting the question, what is it that religion has contributed to political life in this country and more generally? For some people, the answer is very simple. Religion has contributed a whole lot of problems, full stop. It's brought bigotry and division and all sorts of things like that into public life. You won't be surprised if I say I don't think that's the whole story. And I'll talk mostly, of course, about my religion, Christianity, but I can see there are people from other religious traditions here, and they will no doubt have things to say later on. But let me start where I am. Right at the beginning of the Christian church, rather surprisingly, Christians used political language to talk about themselves. The word for church in Greek, the language of lots of early Christians, was the word ecclesia. It's like église in French and so on. And that word originally meant a citizens' meeting. The church started life thinking of itself as a citizens' meeting. That is, it thought of the Christian community as being like the kind of meetings they used to have in ancient cities, when all the citizens would gather in the marketplace to make decisions together. And the early Christians talked about their life together in those ways, believing that they were citizens of the kingdom of God. Not just citizens of the Roman Empire, or wherever, but citizens of the kingdom of God. And the difference that made was that in the kingdom of God, there were no absolute divisions between rich and poor, between different races. Everybody had the same access to God. And so, everybody looked at everybody else with a sort of respect, indeed sort of astonishment, thinking, you know, they're a child of God, they're like me. And that was one of the very important strands at the beginning of Christianity, this sense we're citizens of another place. We're citizens of a kind of country that works differently from the country we're in. The country we're in may be one where the emperor decides everything, where people push you around, where rich people have the right to order the poor around, but that's not the whole truth about us. We actually belong somewhere else, and in that other country, where God is in charge, we can look each other in the eye, we can actually respect each other. And that is a very deep thing in Christianity. It's not exclusive to Christianity. I guess Jews and Muslims would say very much the same thing about where their inspiration comes from. But Christianity took it up in a particular way, which brought it very much into conflict with some of the social patterns that were around. But if you ask where the language of universal human rights came from in Western Europe, then you have to say a lot of it comes from that strong kind of current flowing through the history of Christianity. There's another country, another order of affairs in which the divisions of power and race and so forth don't matter. In the Middle Ages, you see the very beginnings of a language of human rights coming through in some people's writing. When, for example, one of the great theologians in the Middle Ages says that nobody has the right to own another person. No one can own somebody else. Nobody can decide for them how they're going to run their lives. Now that was quite a strong thing to say in the Middle Ages because there were still slaves around. There were still people who were bound to their masters. But this particular theologian wasn't so much saying, okay, we scrap the social order. He was saying there are really limits to the power that any person can have over any other person. And when, for example, a wealthy person who has lots of people working on his land says to those people, I decide whether you can get married or not, I decide what you'll believe, I decide what you'll do day by day, then actually he has no right to do that, because you can't own somebody else's choices. Now, it took a long time for that to sink into the consciousness of society around. You could say it's still sinking into the consciousness of people. But a great deal of our language of human rights does have its origins in that kind of vision. So that's the first point I want to make, really. If we're thinking about human rights and equality before the law, if we're thinking about a society in which how much money you've got, how much status you have doesn't decide everything about you and about your power over others, then a lot of the motivation for that, a lot of the vision for that, comes from that early Christian sense that being in the community of Christian belief, being in relationship to Jesus Christ, as they will put it, takes you into another order of existence, another kind of... And what's interesting is that if you look at the history of, let's say, the 18th century, where very often you have the idea that's when modern ideas really started, there's a rather different story to be told. In the 18th century, absolute monarchs dominated most of Europe, and in the 18th century, the slave trade internationally was at its height. Now, I have to be honest, a lot of Christians defended absolute monarchs, and they defended the slave trade. But what's more interesting than that is that a lot of people we think of as enlightened, modern sort of blokes in the 18th century, the people who got the French Revolution moving and all the rest of it, actually, they had no problems with slavery, and they had no problems with absolute political power. These apparently modern, reasonable people were as stuck as anybody else in ways of thinking which privileged the wealthy, which privileged white people over black, and so on. And it was eventually some very hard-nosed and hard-working Christians who got the law changed about the slave trade at the beginning of the 19th century. Because they said, sorry, at the end of the day, the slave trade may be economically profitable. It may be something that keeps our workers happy in the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, it is just not possible to own another person. End of story. The next question is, how do we translate that into law? And William Wilberforce, as you all know, I'm sure, struggled for decades in Parliament to change the law about the slave trade. And that story is a reminder that even at a time when all sorts of rather oppressive patterns were taken for granted by nearly everybody, there were Christians still in touch with that early and very powerful motivation, which said, you can't own anybody else. In the eyes of God, we're equal. And it's possible to belong to a kind of society where we're all citizens together. We're not citizens versus slaves, we're not insiders and outsiders, we're all involved. Now, how does that relate to our politics today, nationally? How does it relate to the place of my own church, the Church of England, the constitution of this country? It's a long story, but I think the crucial and important bits of it might go something like this. In the 16th century, when the church in this country was reformed with a great deal of upheaval, all the systems have changed, the authority patterns have changed, the chain of command changed. The church was seen as absolutely bound up with the life of society, and so because of that, it was drawn in to the law of the land. The church is by law established, we say. But when the state kind of invited the church in like that, when the monarch became the supreme governor of the Church of England, as Queen Elizabeth was in the 16th century, the state was actually doing something risky. It was saying, okay, we're going to take over the church, but the church said, yes, but we carry on being the church, and therefore we still have the right to ask you some awkward questions. In the 17th century, at the time of the Civil War, even a great supporter of the absolute state at that time, Archbishop Laud, who's over there in the corner, with the remains of his pet tortoise underneath him, Archbishop Laud, who was a real supporter of the king and a real sort of social conservative, even he said, when the state and the king infringe natural justice, when they sanction an exploitative, unjust society, then they lose their authority. Even he said that. So the church, yes, bought into the life of the state, but at the same time, it reserved the right to ask difficult questions. And in the 18th century, 19th century, although the church was mostly very subservient to the state at that time, you still had people, generation after generation, saying, yes, we still have the right to ask the awkward questions. And it was put really well at the beginning of the 19th century by the poet Coleridge, rhyme of the ancient mariner, Coleridge, who said, the church is a critical friend to the state, a critical friend. The church has a real investment in society at large, and the way the law goes and the state goes. It's a friend, but it's a critical friend. It can ask the state the difficult questions. What are you up to? Why is this just? Why should we believe this? And I think in the 19th and 20th centuries, the church has quite often, not always by any means, but quite often, been one of those places where difficult questions can still be asked. So that what the government says doesn't necessarily, automatically, get seen as right or true. There have been times, as I say, when the church has just rolled over and done what the government has told it to. And if you look at the First World War, you'll see lots of bishops of the Church of England saying really hair-raising things about how the great thing is to get out there and kill more Germans. There was the Bishop of London in 1914 who gave an address saying, we're in this war to kill Germans. Good Germans and bad Germans, young Germans and old Germans, innocent Germans and guilty Germans. You think, what was that about? So it's not all a good story. And then in the Second World War, you have one of the very, very great bishops, Bishop Bell of Chichester, who was in touch with all sorts of resistance movements on the continent, saying in the House of Lords, we ought not to be indiscriminately bombing German cities. The government is wrong to go for indiscriminate bombing and killing of civilians. And that cost him a lot.